Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. If you're listening to us for the first time, please like, subscribe, and share this interview. We have a returning guest of about 4 or 5 times, maybe more than that. He's better than Billy Graham. He's better than any preacher or priest or reverend that you ever heard in your life. This is Reverend David Chotka. He's a legend in his own mind. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I had to hit that.
I'm glad to be in the ranks of Billy Graham. He was a great man.
Thanks so much, Reverend David Chotka here on Fire Breathing Rob.
Well, thanks for having me here, Rob. I think it's number 6. I think this is the 6th interview that we've done. And so I think I've posted 3 of them on my own material, and people like them there too. So that's good. I think they like you too, which is very helpful.
We're all struggling with grief. We've had things that have happened to us. We have family members have died immediately. Immediate family members have died, rather. We've saw throughout our lives pets die that maybe mean a lot to us. Yeah. There's a lot of people suffering from family and friends that have died throughout the coronavirus crisis. So a lot of grieving going on right now, a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of mental health issues. Yeah. So not to go and ramble on that, but the question for me to you is, David, is what are the stages of grief and how can we as a people, American, Canadian, wherever the heck you're listening from, really get through this in general, because these are tough times, especially right now.
Sure. Well, I'm aware of 5 stages, actually, rather than 4.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So no, don't be sorry. I made you want to read that. Now, the author who wrote about this is a lady by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She did some groundbreaking work, and it's an older book now. I think it was done in the 1970s or 80s, somewhere in that range. And this kind of examination of the process was done. I must tell you that Kubler-Ross's work has been improved upon since it was originally written. What she did was she talked about 5 stages, and she went through it in a kind of a mechanical way. And what we have discovered is that when people go through a grief process, sometimes all of the order gets mixed up and it gets rearranged. And it doesn't happen in what I call a classic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kind of step. But regardless of that, the very first thing that happens with this is this thing called denial. You hear the news. Now, by the way, I was a police chaplain in the city of Chatham, Ontario. I just had become the police chaplain, and my job was to drive with the officers. And if they wanted pastoral care, I'd give it to them. Or if there was some family in significant crisis, I would be asked to show up with them. And here's what happened. I said yes to the assignment. They had just fitted me with a police uniform. I got into this car, and my very first ride, there was a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. There was a young boy who had had his brains bashed out by a weirdo at a train thing at 3 o'clock in the morning. I had to go and talk to that family. And you got to know, that was not an easy way to begin to try and give pastoral care to some family in terrific grief they were in. And here's the reality. The first stage is what you call denial or shock, if you want to use that word. You just can't believe it. And of course, nobody expects a 6-year-old to be found dead because some idiot has hit the kid over the head with a brick or something. This is just horrible, horrible kind of thing. So usually, and of course, we saw that with this particular case. What happens is you hear about the passing, and even if you're expecting it, even if somebody's had a long road with cancer and they're in the last stages and they're 86 and they die, you still don't want to believe that the person is gone. And so there's this denial thing. And then right after that, the second thing in Kubler-Ross's framework is she says anger, but I would morph that and I would say strong emotion. And sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's hysteria, sometimes it's just an irrational form of behavior, but there's strong emotion that comes after you've gone through this process of recognizing that the person actually died. And then comes what I call the hardest part of the whole thing, bargaining. And you start saying, oh, if I only had, then maybe, well, maybe if I had showed up, this person wouldn't have, or maybe if I was there and I'd have given them their med on time, then maybe perhaps, et cetera, et cetera. You do this kind of bargaining thing. And you actually, whether you believe in God or not, you start talking to some deity, even you can't see him. You say, well, God, maybe. Oh, why did you take me instead of them? That kind of thing. And you do this denial kind of bargaining thing, whether you're talking to the air or whether you're actually talking to God because you believe in him. And people do it. And it's interesting, when people are in great grief, they either talk to God or mother. Even if their mother's dead, They do. It's one of those two things.
David, let me just jump in quickly because you
Let's
just
finish
brought.
the stage, and then you can do that. Okay, so I'll get through.
Okay, sorry.
After that, there's a season of depression, and sometimes that can go on for months. And then finally, there's this thing called acceptance. So those are the 5 things. I'll say them again: denial, strong emotion, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those are the 5 movements that people go through. And sometimes it takes, if you don't know them very much, it can take a few months. If you know them extremely well, it can take years. Okay, so now ask your question.
No, I was just going to jump in because you spoke about people talking to their dead relative, friend, whoever it may be, and also talking a lot to God.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of people that when someone dies that they're friendly with, or, you know, they're maybe a family member in general, or even a pet for that matter. Maybe they don't believe in God.
Yeah.
You know, but they just start talking to God.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. So does that mean they do believe in God? They just maybe, and I even go back to like where I'm at. Like, I know personally I've had a relationship with God in the past. It's kind of went haywire and went into a different direction, which is terrible. And for, you know, at least I personally believe that. And I'm trying to come back into the saddle, you know, and as we've talked about that, and I'm not going to reveal my personal conversations with you, but I've tried to come back in the saddle. It's a work in progress, and you've been helping me with that. So is that what you're seeing with people that are, you know, specifically non-believers, when they do talk to Christ after a family member again, or a friend or a dog or a cat or whatever died?
Well, actually, it's a very interesting thing. Even people who are died-in-the-wool atheists, when somebody passes, everybody's brought face to face with a single fact: you're going to die. whether you want to believe in an afterlife or don't believe in an afterlife, if you think this is it, or if you think there's something special, or if you're aware that consciousness must continue because there's something profound about this thing called consciousness, however you see it, people just cry out. And they do it consciously, they do it unconsciously, they do it psychologically. Many people who are not believers now had a faith in their childhood. Sometimes their parents believed they never could, and they want to believe what their parents believed or their best friend believed or something. And very often in the face of significant loss, especially if it's someone they truly, truly loved, they'll cry out and they'll say, oh, I don't know if I believe. I know Joe over there, that Joe really believes. And when he's in trouble, he cries. So God, the God of Joe, could I talk to you? They actually use their friend's name while they're doing it. Sometimes it's a yearning, it's a wistful longing that it might be true. And you know this, most people really kind of want to believe there's something after the grave. They're not sure what it looks like. In fact, my own dad, for years and years and years, he said, well, there's got to be something. I just don't buy this Jesus stuff, you know. Now, we had conversations about how he did in fact come to faith in Christ, but that's irrelevant to this conversation. But what I want to do is I want to talk to you about how I got introduced to all of this. And it's a hilarious story. It started. And so as it turns out, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Northeast Saskatchewan in a little town called Tisdale. That was actually a thriving metropolis compared to the place 30 miles up the street, where I started to work in the ministry. So the denomination I was serving in those days required us to have a summer internship under a seasoned pastor who would teach us the ropes. You know, he'd show us how to do a funeral, how to do a wedding, what to do at a board meeting. You know, what do you do when you're trying to prepare a sermon? How do you prepare a sermon? How do you get feedback? And what about giving pastoral care to those people in hospital over there? All those kinds of things that are part of a pastor's life. You don't just sort of come at it cold. You should have somebody coach you along so that you're not an idiot when you walk into the hospital and see something dumb. You know, there's nothing worse than going to the hospital and saying, get up. that won't do when you're giving pastoral care. At any rate, here's what happens. So I come to this little town. It's called Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan. It's not on Hudson Bay. It's actually on the border of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And for all you Americans, if you get to Lake Superior and move over about 2 inches on your map and go straight up the line, and you drive for 6 hours at 60 miles an hour from the Wisconsin or the Minnesota state line and go straight north, you come into that place where I was. Anyway, it's cold, and not in the summertime though. It's actually quite warm there. Anyway, I was a student minister in this little town called Mestatum, population 200, salute, okay? And it was attached to a church that had 3 preaching points. So there was a large church in the town of Hudson Bay, and there was a little church in a little town called Prairie River, another one called Mestatum. And I had to be the student pastor, the 2 country charges, while the main pastor took care of the larger church in the city. Anyway, the bottom line was he was going on vacation. And so he had a couple weeks vacation, and I went in to see him, and I had to see him once a week to tell him how I was doing. And he said, well, David, I'm going away. And I said, well, Joe, what happens if there's a funeral when you're gone? And he said, David, this is a young town. Everybody here is under 30 or 35. There hasn't been a funeral in 4 years in this church. But in the unlikely event that you have to do a funeral, you need to go down the road and talk to Joyce. I said, well, who's Joyce? She said, well, she's a member of the church here. And she did all the arrangements the last time we had a funeral because I didn't know what I was doing. He said, there's only been about 4 deaths in this town in the last 10 years. I said, oh, wow, okay. So I went down the street and I visited Joyce and her husband, Bill, and they had a nice little visit. And then I went back to my church, and then Joe went on vacation. And my phone rang, and there was a funeral. It was Joyce. She died. The lady who had made all the arrangements. So, and I had never had a loss. I had never been to a funeral. I have 2 brothers. They were both alive. My parents were alive. My relatives were all alive. I hadn't had a significant loss. I do remember that someone in the school died, but I didn't know the kid. I didn't go to the funeral. So I just didn't know how to relate to somebody in a coffin. I didn't know how to relate to giving care to anybody. And oh man, we were in a panic. And, the whole congregation rose up to try and help me because they didn't know what to do and I didn't know what to do, but they had to give care to this family because it was a member of their church. And anyway, here's what they did in the long run. They brought in a pastor who'd been there years before. He drove 6 hours north to come to do that service. And I watched him very closely. And I took copious notes. And he gave me all of his notes, and he said, well, this is what you need to do. And why don't you go and talk to that funeral director over there, and maybe he can give you some pointers too. And so I thanked him, and he allowed me to assist him in the event. Away he went, drove back 6 hours south again. And 2 days later, there was another funeral. And 2 days after that, there was another funeral. And 2 days after that, I did 4 funerals in 2 weeks. And the pastor of that church hadn't done any funerals in 4 years. He gets back with this chagrined look on his face. He was 3 provinces over in British Columbia, having a nice holiday. Thank you very much. And he hears, he hears about me having to do this job. So I learned the hard way. And so I learned how to do it, and I learned how to show up after people were in trouble. And that's when I actually went to work on discovering what the stages of grief were. So that's when I read the Kubler-Ross book, and that's when I discovered that people go through these cycles. At any rate, that was followed by my taking a church, and then my younger brother committed suicide. Oh my heavens! All my head learning. I'll just tell you, in your mind what you should be doing and how you should be going about it. But when you're as raw as a sore tooth and you haven't got people beside you, here's what happened. I had changed churches. I was assigned to a new one. I had just committed this new church. My wife and I adopted our daughter. We went down to see my brother and my parents to introduce our little girl to them after a month of bonding with us. She was 1 year old when we got her. And we had a beautiful day. Came back to my church in the Toronto area, and my brother took his life. And it was, oh man, was it a blow. Just an awful, awful blow. It took me 2 years. 2 years before the sky wasn't gray again. I'm a pretty cheerful guy. You probably noticed. I like to laugh, and I like to tease. I like to make fun. And I couldn't do that for months. And here's what I did. Believe it or not, it was a Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, when this happened. I was preparing my special services for this high and holy weekend. Of course, it's the highlight of the Christian year, the Holy Week that starts on Palm Sunday. Then you have Maundy Thursday with the foot washing, and you have Good Friday with the death of Christ on the cross and the grief that's attached to that. And then you have Resurrection Sunday when you celebrate. It was the day before Good Friday in my new church. And I did not know the people of that church very well yet. And so they didn't know how to give care to me because I hadn't been there more than a few months. So I hadn't made long-term friendships there. It was the people from my old church that called when they heard, who were able to give care, but they were 3 hours away in a drive one way. So they called on the phone, but they couldn't come, a lot of them, because they were working. At any rate, it was a terrible grief. And I did go through this thing called denial. I mean, I heard the news. My dad called me. He found my brother dead in the basement. And I had to get in the car and drive an hour and a half to get to be with my parents because they were in shock that my brother had taken his life in their own basement. Then we had to call the police to come and get the body, and I watched them take that body out of the house. And he was younger than me. And you're not supposed to die younger than, you're not supposed to, my parents aren't supposed to bury their kids, see? And so I must tell you, the only thing that carried us through that was the compassionate care of friends of the family of years. And my parents' new faith, they had just become believers. My dad had had an experience of Christ. And you got to know, there's a book in the Bible called Lamentations. You know what it is? Somebody whining. It's a lament. And it was actually written by Jeremiah the prophet when his city was overrun by conquerors and everything was burned to the ground. And so people were killed and the city was burned to the ground. And he prays this ugly, ugly prayer about how God wrecked the city. And it's a horrible, awful venting of all of the venom that was on its wound. And I just have to say this to you. Sometimes the most important thing you can do when you're grieving is yell or whine or cry or say stupid things. And I will actually tell you that the thing that cured me was long walks in a conservation area. And it took me 2 years. I started to walk. And I was beyond soulless because this is my own flesh and blood. It was my own brother. I played with him when I was a kid, and we did little chores together and we did games together. And we separated because our views were different. I became a believer and he did not. And so there was this antagonistic kind of thing between us. And my parents didn't know what they believed, but they just wanted peace in the family. But there was a lot of tension and strife in the family for years. And then he finally seemed to settle into a routine. He got himself a decent job. And then I think personally, he was on antidepressant meds. I think they changed his meds and he got well enough to make a plan to kill himself. And then he wanted to see our new daughter, and he did really beautifully with that little girl, played with her, threw her in the air, made her giggle and laugh, crawled on the floor with her. He climbed a tree while she watched and clapped, that kind of thing. And then he played with my 6-year-old son when this was happening. And then 2 days later, he was gone. And it was this thing. And I went through these phases. So here's how it goes. First of all, there's the shock, right? And then here's what I did. I got really, really, really emotional. And I would go from weeping and crying to shouting at the sky, And that's when I started doing those long walks in the conservation area. It was in April. And so in Ontario, Southern Ontario, similar to New York State or similar to Vermont or something, the thaw was beginning, but it was still pretty cool out. And sometimes you get a bright sunny spring day, and sometimes you get a winter day. And it was in that in-between time. And I would walk through that refreshing air and I would complain. I would lament. I would cry out. And if you don't, you're going to stuff it. That's just, don't stuff it. Let it out. Now you need to let it out with somebody safe, or you need to let it out when you're alone and it is safe. But if you push it down, it turns into a festering wound and it turns into a deeper depression than you need. And so I found myself having to let this wound open up to the world so that the air could blow over my pus. You know what I'm saying? You can clean the wound off by speaking, even as more pus came in and you'd yell again. And I don't know how many months that went on. I know that I was very thankful I had 4 weeks vacation in July. I took time off. I had to do Easter because I was a solo pastor of a new church, and I did what I had to do. And then I just took time off, and my congregation understood because they heard the story. And they were disturbed about the whole thing because they had no idea, and I had no idea this was going to happen. So anyway, then I did the bargaining thing. I said, well, Lord, if I had only just sort of called him the next day, maybe he wouldn't have took his life. You know what? Maybe if I'd been kinder to him when I was younger, maybe he wouldn't have took my life. And then I'd call my dad and my mom, and they'd say the same thing. Maybe if we had just helped him with financially when he was in trouble, he wouldn't have, all this. And that went on for months. And then there was this thing called depression. And here's what it looked like for me. The sky, even when it was bright and sunny, felt gray. It just felt gray. And you'd wake up in the morning and you were listless. And then you'd wonder about what's going on. Is he in heaven or hell? He took his life. Thou shalt not kill is one of the commands. Is he in heaven? Is he in hell? Did God forgive him because he cried out because he said, I'm being an idiot. Stop me, God. And it was too late. I don't know what he did. Nope. Who knows what was in his head? And the thing that cured me was I was walking in that conservation area, and I was reflecting on a psalm. And the psalm said this: Lord, if you counted sins, who could stand? But with you, there's forgiveness. And here's what I can tell you. That younger brother of mine knew exactly how to push my buttons. When he wanted to get me mad, he could get me mad. When he wanted to make me happy, he knew exactly how to make me happy. He was actually very, very creative, very brilliant. In fact, here's what he did. I have this present still here. On one of my birthdays, he gave me this book press, and you put a seal in it, and you put your book page in there, and you press the seal, and it makes my name imprinted on the book. It's a very, very thoughtful gift because I love books. So he could be thoughtful or he could be an idiot. And I still have it. And whenever I see it, I think of him. In fact, right on my desk right now, there you go. But anyway, when the day was done, I realized that when he did me dirt, it would take me forever to forgive the guy, even though it was my own brother. But as soon as I would say, please, Lord, forgive, God would not treat me as my sins deserve in a second. And then I said, okay, God, if he was in my hands, I'd slap him around for being such an idiot. And then I'd shake him a little bit. And then I'd take him for a long walk and yell at him. And then I'd try and reconcile that and hug him because he's back. But I can't do that because I'm not the author of life and death. I don't have that power. And I thought, but I know this with God. All that he needed to do, God's not tallying up his sins. He's not tallying up whether he's been an idiot or not. And I don't know anybody who hasn't sinned. Rob, you're a nice guy, but I think you've sinned a few times. You're looking at me as a preacher, you're a good guy. You compare me to Billy Graham and all the best. And you said I was, like the best of the best. I have to tell you something. I stink with sin, and so do you. And there are attitudes in me that are wrong. There are behaviors that are wrong. There are things that I've done in the past that I regret. I've repented of them, but they're still there. And God doesn't keep a tally of sins. What he does is he wants us to come to him and name him so that we can be well, so that we can be healed. And as I reflected on that psalm going for that walk, I realized this. His hands are better than mine. And whatever it is that's happened to my brother, he's in God's hands now, not mine. And then, it's about 2 years in, the sky was blue again. Now, did I forget him? I can't. So here's the process that Kubler-Ross names. She talks about first of all, denial or shock or whatever, followed by strong emotion, followed by bargaining, followed by depression, followed by acceptance. And in my case, I kept going back and forth between each of these phases. I would go to the anger when I was halfway through the depression. And then when I was thinking I was accepting, I would become depressed again. And then it would go through this. And it wasn't until that moment where I was walking through the Heart Lake Conservation Area in Brampton, Ontario. I put my foot on a stick, the stick broke. Suddenly I remembered that God didn't count sins. And the breaking of a stick now is like a trigger in my head. And I realize my hands are really useless when it comes to managing crisis. God's hands are magnificent beyond imagining. So that's the process of grieving. And the only way through it, and I think that for the sake of your listeners, the only way through it is to admit it. Like, it's not a wrong thing to experience extreme emotion. It's not a wrong thing to pass through a valley of despair. It's not a wrong thing to have these crazy conversations with the dead person in your head. It's not a wrong thing to lament and to cry and to whine and to scream and even to say things that you think are ugly. You read the book of Lamentations in the Bible. The guy blames God for everything. Why did you do that? It's Jeremiah the prophet, right? And in the middle of it, right smack dab in the middle of all that whining about how bad things are, he says this I call to mind, the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Now, he's saying that as he's looking at a city that's been leveled. And in a war zone, I mean, we're talking about extreme loss. We're not talking about one death. We're talking about friends killed by swords and, by arrows and bows and spears, and women taken away from their husbands, and men dead, and children taken as slaves, and the city leveled. We're not talking about something small. We're talking about something major, catastrophic. And in the middle of that, Jeremiah says that. So what it means is you can feel mercy even in the middle of disaster, even in the middle of it.
Again, Reverend David Chotka, the legend of Canada as far as this faith goes, and also around the U.S. too. He does come to the U.S. quite frequently and preaches all over the place. That's why he is the legend, and we're lucky we have him on this program. David, where can people find more about you, learn more about you, get the book when it comes out? I'm sure we'll have you on when the book comes out in general.
I have 3 books out now, and the new one's coming out in February. You get them all on Amazon. So this one is a scholarly workshop on prayerful discernment. It's called Sifting Our Discerning. This one is my very first book. It's called Power Praying. It's about the Lord's Prayer. We did an interview about that. This is a co-write done with Reverend Dr. Maxie Dunham, Healing Prayers, God's Idea. And I have a little booklet you can get on my website. But my website is www.spirit, like in spiritual, spirit, equip, like in equipment. You put spirit and equip side by side, www.spiritequip.com. And if you go there, there are links to my Facebook page, to my YouTube channel, and there's links to my blogs, etc. And you could subscribe to receive regular blogs. I'm doing them once a week now. I used to do them twice a week, but the speaking schedule is starting to pick up, and so I'm finding that I have to make sure that's not so hard to do. So at any rate, I can do once a week, and I can manage to make it sustainable. But you can subscribe to that, and if you want to be in touch with me, you just go to the website and click on the contact form. Hey, if you want to make a donation, you can click on the give button too. You get a tax receipt. I actually am working on getting an American tax receipt. Probably in about a month, I'll be in a position to make it possible for U.S. donors to be able to get an American tax receipt. So I've got that in Canada right now, but I'm working away. I'm starting from the north and I'm moving toward the south. That's what I'm doing. So there you go. That's
and then eventually you'll get to Mexico too.
Well, I have a timeshare in Mexico. I've got it real cheap. About once a year, I go down to Puerto Vallarta. So there you go.
David Chotka, again, thanks so much for your time. It's always a pleasure. And I look forward to our next conversation real soon.
God bless. And we'll talk probably for the book launch.